Welcome to the 2026 Travel Unity Spring Summit. My name's Elena Thayer, and I go to Purdue University, and I'm studying hospitality and tourism management. And so I was given the opportunity to join some of these informational sessions about like Travel Unity. And I'm very excited that everyone is joining us for this session, whether you're here now or you're watching later. First, I want to say like a thank you to our sponsors for supporting this virtual summit. Los Angeles Tourism, Visit Syracuse, Travel Alliance Partnership, the New York Yankees, New Orleans and Company, and Nova HCM. So just a quick overview of who we are. For those newer to it, Travel Unity is mainly a nonprofit. It's focused on making travel welcoming to people of all backgrounds and identities and being inclusive. Um, this year, June 20th, marks our 10th anniversary of Travel Unity. Um, Basically, Travel Unity helps the travel industry kind of align with like the inclusive practices, and it helps spread awareness about the different careers and the amount of careers that are in the travel industry and the hospitality industry. And there's many programs that can help with this. It's a tool for people to help advocate for making their communities more welcoming and a safe space for everybody to be included. And move to the next slide. If you're interested in supporting Travel Unity, there's a few ways you can do that. Volunteering is one of the main ways that you can help out. All volunteers either start by doing a case study on inclusion in travel or a spotlight on a travel industry professional. Um, you could also join a working group, which they're listed on the slides in front of you. And if you have any questions or you want any information on how to get involved with Travel Unity, you can email Ronnie, and his email is right there at the bottom, ronnie@travelunity.org. Um, so what to know right now, there, if you have registered on the site, you've entered to win two New York Yankees tickets for a 2026 season game. Each ticket is worth up to $320. And there will also be giving away a couple hardcover copies of Stronger Together, Building World-Changing Collaborations That Succeed by Nicole Mahoney. During these sessions, please use the chat to discuss throughout and to put any questions that you may have. Be prepared to share any questions or comments at the end of the session. We'll welcome anybody who wants to participate in that. A little bit more to know. If you're not part of the Travel Unity Alliance, please consider joining. There are individual memberships as well as organizational memberships. Um, there are student educator discounts, which is about $50 a year. And if you would like sessions like this one that we're having today, then your membership includes um, free meetings, monthly Alliance Travel Unity meetings. Um, yeah, so our first session of the day today is Public Lands, Public Memory, American Stories at 250. Um, and that'll happen soon, but I just quickly wanted to share with you what's coming up later and what's going to happen tomorrow and Thursday. After this session, we have America, the Land I Still Love, Choosing and Building a Life in the US. On Wednesday will be Innovation, Technology, and the Human Experience and the Future of the Travel Workforce. Finally, on Thursday, we will have Local Action, How Your Voice Drives Community Change, and Caught in the Middle, Destinations in Uncertain Times. So At this time, I'd like to invite our moderator, Nikki Rivera from She Shapes History, to kick off today's first session. Thank you.
Oh, no, no, you don't get to do that because
Oh,
you get applause. Good work, Elena. That was
thank
wonderful. Excellent
you.
job. All right. Now, Nikki, it's yours.
Yes, well done. Thank you very much for that. I'm Nikki. I'm with She Shapes History. We've actually just launched and we run walking tours of New York City, the badass women of New York City. It's telling the stories of hidden women, stories that we should all know their names and we don't, and that is crazy. So our purpose is to share those stories. And I'm really excited for this conversation today, about public lands. Public lands are not just places people visit, right? They shape how the story of the United States is told and how we understand ourselves as a country in relation to that history, who tells the history, how that history is told. And the tension around whose stories are represented on public lands is not new. Right? We had a prep call and we've really talked a lot about this. The way history is interpreted affects how people understand the nation, past, present, future. However, who gets to tell this story of that history has to do with power, as everything does, right? So we're going to explore a lot of that today. This is very relevant as the United States approaches its 250th anniversary. The session is going to examine how narratives across the country are presented on public lands and through tourism specifically. We're going to explore what stories have been incomplete, how federal decisions influence interpretation, and how organizations can approach this work thoughtfully and responsibly moving forward. So we're going to start just with broad introductions. So I'll name you and I'll let everyone introduce themselves. First on my screen, I have Sherry. Sherry, do you want to start? Introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Nikki. Sherry Rupert here. I'm the CEO for the American Indigenous Tourism Association. We are a national nonprofit, Indigenous-run organization. We work with the 575 federally recognized tribes and Native Hawaiians across the country to advance cultural tourism and to market all of their amazing product.
I'll cut in quickly. Keith Henry was on our session yesterday from Indigenous Tourism Association Canada
Oh,
and
great.
mentioned Sherry and AIT a few times. So it's great to have both of you as part of the summit this week.
Thank you, Sherry. I'll pass to Alan if you want to introduce yourself, please.
Nikki, thank you. I'm Alan Spears, the Senior Director for Cultural Resources at the National Parks Conservation Association, based here in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Alan. And Dennis.
Good morning. I'm Dennis Arguelles, MPCA's Southern California Director, where I work on park protection and expansion efforts in California and as well in Hawaii and the Pacific Islands.
Thank you, Dennis. This is like a proper roll call. And last but not least, Timothy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Timothy Leonard. I'm also with NPCA, though I'm based in our New York City office. So we've come full circle, I see here. But I work a lot on issues around LGBT history, especially at Stonewall National Monument. So happy to be here.
It's a very interesting mix of places where everyone is based and what we're going to be talking about today. But I am going to start with Alan, and I've realized there's a lovely elevator music playing in behind me. So in case you hear it coming in and out, that's in my room. Alan, I'm going to start with you, and this is a very big question, but what is the role of national parks in all of this, in storytelling, and how is NPCA responding to what's happening right now?
Well, Nikki, thanks for the question. I think the National Park Service was formally established in 1916. In PCA, we got our start 3 years later in 1919, and national parks represent some of the most significant, beautiful, wonderful places on at least the North American landscape and elsewhere. And they are chock full of historic and cultural and natural resources. And they are meant to commemorate some of the nation's most significant places and some of our most significant history. The challenge, I think, with national parks, to go right into the challenges, is that many of the places that we know as these wonderful, especially large landscape national parks out in the West, are ancestral homelands for people who are in many instances removed. So we have stories to tell, we've got natural resources and historic and cultural resources to protect and preserve, but we also have to balance that with a little bit of justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion in the work that we do. which is what I think NPCA is trying to do these days, and especially as it relates to the history erasure campaign that's being initiated by this administration, where we actually have a government that's put together a list of things that they don't like or that they regard as being problematic in terms of the interpretation that's being provided by our colleagues in the National Park Service, and they'd like to see many of those things taken out, taken away, some of those stories moved out. So we've got a couple of different things happening right now in our national parks. We've got a more than 100-year-old national park system, National Park Service, which I'm a great fan of, and we've got some significant historic and cultural and natural resource and justice issues that we're working on as well. And I think we'll be able to talk about a little bit of all that today during this conversation. So, a lot of moving parts, a lot of things going on right now, a lot of opportunity, and unfortunately, a lot of challenges that we're facing right now. And I'll stop with that.
Yeah, no, that's well said. Because it is a lot of opportunity despite the challenges, but it just makes the work a little more difficult. Sherry, leaning into this or continuing that thought, can you share AIT's perspective on what's happening now and how AIT works with the National Park Service, maybe currently and even historically?
Sure. Yes, we have a an umbrella agreement with the National Park Service, so that helps us to more easily work with the parks, and we've done some really great work. I'll mention a couple of different projects we've worked on. First is the Grand Canyon, the Desert Watchtower area. We worked early on with the park there to bring more culture into the park in that particular area. When I first went there to the Desert Watchtower, went inside, there was a concessionaire in there, but most of the things in there were, made from other countries and weren't really the authentic indigenous artistry that is so prevalent, especially in that area. And so we worked really hard with the Park Service. They put together a tribal advisory committee of the 11 tribes of the Grand Canyon that advised on what they would like to see in the park. And so in that particular area, the concessionaires were bought or changed out, and that area was designated as really the tribal cultural area. And they had artists there, demonstrations. So visitors could experience the national park in a new way, from a different perspective. And I think that's so important because, as the gentleman said earlier, uh, these places were once our homes, were our ancestral homelands. And we still have deep connections to these spaces. The other project that we worked on was at Mount Rainier and the 6 tribes affiliated with Mount Rainier. And we worked with the superintendent there and his senior staff and brought them out to visit the tribes on their homelands now. And it was just so heartwarming to see the um, the generosity of the tribes as they welcomed the Park Service staff to their homelands and spoke to them not just about their history, but who they are now as Indigenous people and their love and connection to Mount Rainier. So through that process, we were able to create and develop curriculum on informal relationships, how important informal relationships are, because we know that the federal agencies have protocols for their their relationship with tribes and the way they have to interact with them. But what we're trying to do is to create those informal relationships where they actually get to know one another and get to understand each perspective. And so we do have that curriculum now, and we've already had our first course we launched in January with the Park Service, and we're hoping to get that out park wide, so relationships can be enhanced across the park.
That's incredible. I have a follow-up actually that I thought of as you were speaking. We're going to talk a lot about the administration and the tension between there and the goal of the NPCA, but I'm curious, you'd mentioned that there was a board of tribe leaders. Is there ever tension between what the tribes themselves want? And does that conflict at all with what the Park Service wants? And what do you do when you get to those moments?
Yeah, I mean, there are difficult conversations between the two because, the Park Service has, run things a certain way for a long period of time. And the tribal leadership and representatives um, have been in these areas for thousands of years. So it does, they do butt heads, but it takes a lot of work to have these conversations. And I mean, it worked. They had those hard conversations at the Grand Canyon, and what they came up with was something beautiful, and it increased their visitation, especially to that area, because people are seeking those experiences with Indigenous people, wanting to understand, how they lived off the land and their spiritual connection to those places, and just walking away transformed with a new perspective and sharing that, with their families as they go back to their homes. So it can be done. It just takes a lot of work. And like I said, the informal relationships, I think, are really important in that process.
Yeah, thank you. I think you really hit that on the head because it is, from my perspective in tours and activities, I agree. I think the customer wants this. They're looking for more meaningful interactions. They're looking for more first person interactions and stories they want to hear directly from people and then be able to determine on their own. Because we're having this realization, history is, as we all know, written by the victors and it's not updated as often. And so I think there is a hunger now for doing more original source research, for lack of a better word, even if they're not using that sophisticated of a term. But it takes work. And so you're not going to see on Viator, on Get Your Guide, you're not going to see that level of experience because for the average tour operator that's trying to have a business and bring in a sustainable business financially, you're not going to have as many resources to dedicate. So I think that's why we don't see that because it does take so much work, but that's what makes the work even that much more important to get done as difficult as it can be.
Right. And that's one of the things that we talk about is, when you're working with tribes, it can't be just, sending a letter or showing up one time for a meeting. It's about building the relationship and building that trust and respect for one another.
So it takes just the time and the dedication to be willing to help tell that story in a better way. It's
Right.
very important. Um, Timothy, we're sort of bumping into a more modern era. We're talking about tribes that have been there thousands of years. Stonewall, I think, is such an interesting example of NPCA because being a New Yorker, it's like, no, we have, national parks in New York City, and people don't think of these locations. Stonewall's obviously been in the headlines a lot very recently. Do you mind giving us just a general overview of what's happening right now?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I will say we have about a dozen national park sites here in New York City. The biggest one, of course, being the Statue of Liberty, which we all know about. But my remarks really echo a lot of what Sherry just said. When people go to national park sites and public lands, they have an expectation that they are going to receive an amazing history lesson, that they're going to walk away as they're in the actual footsteps of where history happened, in this case in New York City, where the Stonewall Uprising happened, or any national park site, you walk away a transformed person because you have these experiences that you take in with every one of your five senses about what it's like to be in these iconic places. And at Stonewall, that expectation has been altered. And it's been, I think we've seen in the news a couple of national park sites where the history has been changed. There have been components of the stories that have been erased or censored. We saw this in Philadelphia at Independence Hall. That same thing happened at Stonewall. In fact, it happened at Stonewall almost over a year ago. It was really one of the first sites that really saw components of the story being taken down. About, I would say, last February or so, we saw a ban on trans flags being allowed to be displayed at the national park site at Stonewall. We saw the removal of the T and the Q from the monument's website and from the language that the rangers are able to use when visitors come and learn the story of the Stonewall Uprising. And then more recently, of course, we saw the removal of the pride flag at Stonewall National Monument. So all of those components are key pieces of this story, not only of the uprising, but of the legacy that continues to this day of what happened back in 1969. And when you start removing some of those pieces, you're not getting the full story. You're not getting the full history. You're receiving a sanitized, inaccurate version. And that's not why people visit national parks and public lands. So we've been working at NPCA to fight back, or I guess fight for the reinstatement of some of those components and then prevent any more removals of that story. But this is not specific to Stonewall. This is something that we're seeing across national park sites in varying different places with various themes. So not limited to LGBTQ plus history either, but it's something that we've seen, I would say, escalate the most at Stonewall so far.
What's so interesting to me, Ronnie, I'm going totally off script. Apologies. Both these organizations truly are the gatekeeper is not the right word, but the in between in how the story is told, right? Like these are the organizations that are shaping and changing and almost doing this good work and important work of making sure the right story is being told, that it's being told in an accessible way. But you almost in a way don't have how much direct access do you have for a park like Stonewall to the direct customer? I know you mentioned the Rangers, but what I mean, is someone in New York City like, can you book a meeting with a park ranger or a tour of the regular tours? And then how much do you work with tours on the ground? And I know, for example, we have a mutual friend, Michael from Christopher Street Tours, who does amazing tours of LGBTQ history in New York City, but especially in Greenwich Village. And he certainly passes through Stonewall. I know he's very active in keeping up with you. And so you have some sort of voice in, um, or you can help him with the messaging, right? You have some sort of control over that messaging. But there are how many other tours that pass through Greenwich Village and pass by Stonewall that probably have zero contact with you. What do you do in that case? And do you have some sort of outreach or how does that work?
That's right. And there are tons of organizations that provide tours. When we were establishing the Stonewall site back in 2016, we're actually Stonewall is about 10 days younger than Travel Unity. But we worked with local tour operators to make sure that they were incorporating components of the Stonewall story into the tours that they give. NPCA hosted a training session for tour operators and for NPS rangers to hear from LGBTQ community members and historians about what needed to be incorporated in those stories. And of course, you can always go on recreation.gov and arrange for a tour with the National Park Service Rangers at Stonewall as well.
Very cool. That's very good to know. Okay, excellent. Let's see, I'll keep going. I'll go back to the script now. This is oh, actually, Dennis, I wanted to pull to you because this is another side of it, um, about the complications of how these stories are living and they change and new information comes, and we're now forced to look at what we knew and how that history has changed. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on in your region?
Sure. I assume, Nikki, you're referring to what's happening with Cesar Chavez and his legacy.
Yes.
And maybe right off the top, we should just maybe jump into that. Just so you know, as I mentioned, I work on park protection and expansion efforts in Southern California. Lately, I've been focused primarily on protection because that's where we're at today. On better times, I've been working to try to tell more stories and expand the representation, particularly of communities of color and other communities in the national park system, including Latinos, and working to expand it until recently the Cesar Chavez National Monument. All I can say in relation to that is there's definitely needs to be a reckoning and a reconciliation in relation to his legacy. I think NPCA, our role is not to figure that out ourselves, but to center the farm worker institutions and community organizations, the Latino community, immigrant and labor organizations, center them in this conversation, see how where they are at on the aftermath of these horrific revelations. One thing that's important to know is that the farm worker movement was much broader than Cesar Chavez. And in fact, we were working on a broader park that would tell the stories of many other communities, including Filipino farm workers who were actually critical to the founding of the UFW at the time. And in the process, I think NPCA's interest is in making sure that we stay true to telling that story and representing those communities, regardless of the aftermath of the existing national monument that's currently in his name or any future parks that are created around the farm worker movement.
Thank you. We when we had this prep call, we were chatting about this and asking Dennis, is it okay to talk about Cesar Chavez? But I think what's tricky is when it comes to interpretation, and I'm speaking of my own opinion here, I think we have this habit in the US especially of being very black and white. That Martin Luther King Jr. is a great example that we can speak about Martin Luther King Jr. and the amazing things that he's done, but we cannot talk about his affairs because then it really breaks our brains. Like we can't hold both these spaces at the same time that people are human and they're imperfect and it gets very tricky. It's very nuanced storytelling. And kind of going back to this whole idea of how can you tell a story as nuanced as that through a plaque, through a park? I mean, is that really what goes into your work when you're thinking of programming and language? Like that feels like such a big task to undertake.
Absolutely. And it's the role of the Park Service to take that on. And in normal years would be hopefully a credible broker in trying to navigate that. I think our role is to just again center the communities that are most impacted or whose histories we're trying to tell. And I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with naming something after an individual. It's only when you lionize that individual and you try to tell a very complex and broad history. Again, the farm worker movement was much broader than Cesar Chavez by using just an individual. I think that's in many ways a very Western kind of way of looking at history. And one thing I learned in the process of trying to work on the project that was going to expand on the existing monument was that the communities out there knew that this history was much broader than Cesar Chavez, and they wanted to make sure that those stories were told as well. And in fact, the original legislation to expand the current monument was called the Cesar Chavez National Historical Park. And working with these communities, we at least got that changed to Cesar Chavez and Farm Worker Movement National Historical Park. Now I think we have a chance to go back to the drawing board and maybe just start from scratch and really think about how to tell the story properly.
I am okay, that makes sense. And it's like that is the job. The job is to figure out how to tell these stories in the best way. And I imagine, Sherry, you do a lot of this at AIT as well. And I'll open this up to anyone to answer, but this kind of leads into my next story of, what actually goes into telling these full stories? How do these communities of color navigate telling their own stories? And especially as you all as that role of interpreting these stories, like what is the process there? Is it, as Sherry said, this very long process? You need to have several. Are you meeting with people on the ground? Are you taking in oral histories? How are you gathering that information? And then how do you go about interpreting it? It's a very big question. Go ahead,
I mean,
Timothy.
I'll just say at Stonewall, because it's a relatively new park site, we were involved in it from start to where it is now. We couldn't tell that story as ourselves at NPCA or even as the Park Service without being rooted in the community and hearing from them that this was their story. This was how they wanted that story to be told. They wanted the National Park Service to federally recognize this narrative, this movement, and by having that recognition at the federal level, it puts it on the same par as other civil rights movements, as these other iconic national park sites and stories. It codifies LGBTQ plus history as American history. And so there was a value that we heard from the community itself in terms of how they wanted their story told. And that was really important for us. I think if we didn't have that initial movement, we wouldn't have moved forward with advocating for that park site itself either.
Yeah, and it, kind of goes to my earlier comments in regard to, telling those full stories is you have to work with the communities there. It has to be native led. It has to be the native voices that are telling their stories in these parks. And so they have to decide what's going to be shared and what's allowable to be shared, because there are some things in our culture that we don't want to share with other people. And so any one person might have an idea of what that is, but that's just their idea of what should be told. You really have to get the community together. And we see that in other work that we do around the country as well. We just finished up a project on the Juan Bautista de Anza National Historic Trail. We've worked on the California Trail with BLM. We've worked with um, on the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail, and all of this work. It's all about meeting the tribes where they are and finding out what it is that they like to share, and really it comes a lot back to we want people to understand and know that we are still here as Indigenous people. You know, we can talk about the history, we can share the history, but we want people to know we're here. And we also want to invite them to come out and to visit what we have to share now.
This reminds me, I saw someone spoke, this is years and years ago, but there was someone in the Canadian, it was the Canadian, probably your counterparts in Canada, a similar organization, and they had this this gentleman who was running tours for them, activities, and they said when they approached him, they had pitched this idea of, oh, people want to see what your life is like today, like how you're living off the land and how that converts into being more modern. Because as I said before, people are curious; they want to see the day to day. And it was so interesting. That panel was about how to work responsibly with the communities. And they said, it was such an easy pitch in a way, but he was like, so they want to come and do my chores. And they're like, yes, yes, they would love to come and like chop wood and help you do things. And he's like, okay, but they're going to pay me money to come and do my chores. Like there was almost such an education that needed to happen on his end. He's like, I mean, they're more than welcome, but it's to your point, like there are things that they don't even know probably that they could share, or what is interesting, or what is has been erased that these communities are not aware of because it's their lived experience. And they're probably not as aware of what the perception is from the outside, which actually brings me to my next question of erasure. This is not new. This has happened forever, across the world. And I'm curious if any of you have thoughts on what is different about the current moment compared to what is unique about the moment right now, the erasure that is currently happening and that we've alluded to, and maybe what lessons from the past could we potentially learn from and apply today?
I'll go ahead and start. Um, so, this isn't new to any of us on erasure of our cultures. For us as Indigenous people, um, this goes back to the boarding school era in the late 1800s, where the federal government was removing our children from our homes and from our homelands and putting them in Indian boarding schools, away from their families and away from any influence of the tribe or their families, to assimilate them into their culture. And so not allowing us to speak our languages or practice any of our traditions. I mean, it was a full-on effort to to make us like everybody else, to take away anything that made us Indigenous. And so all along, the government has thrown challenges our way. And because of the resilience of our people, we've been able to overcome many of those challenges and make some headway in telling our stories and letting people know that we are still here, that these parks were our homelands, that we still have this connection. And it's just very concerning and heartbreaking that now we're stepping back, we're moving back to previous times, where our stories and our connection are being erased, and our voices essentially are being erased. And but on the other hand, we're also looking at this as an opportunity. If the parks won't tell our story, then we certainly are going to tell our stories in our communities that are adjacent to these parks. Um, so we're preparing our businesses for this, to look at this as an opportunity to bring them directly to the communities so so visitors can support not only the stories, but support economically as well.
Alan, you had mentioned in your first introduction about challenges and opportunities. Can you speak a little bit more, maybe about the opportunities perhaps that you're seeing in response to the challenges?
Opportunities. I think this is a time for all of us to be small O optimists. So, assuming we get out of the mess that we're in right now, there's an opportunity to think about how we build back better, but not the same in terms of Park Service and federal preservation programs and relationships. So, I think some people are starting to have conversations about that. But, Nikki, I'd have to share with you and the folks here that we're still in the middle of a pretty knockdown, drag out fight. And we're in the middle of a knockdown, drag out fight we could lose. And so before we embrace the notion of talking about opportunities, which is always important to keep your eye cast towards like that far horizon, um, we really have to work together to defeat efforts that are, I'll stop and I'll say this, the process of preservation and commemoration in this country is inherently political because people are making decisions about who gets resources and who doesn't, what stories get told and celebrated and which don't. And we have had a long history of people being deliberately overlooked or neglected or ignored. But this is the first time that I can recall where we have actually had policies emanating from the government that said, this is the stuff we don't like and it's got to go. So there's a little bit of a difference this time around. Um, Even back in the day during the Reconstruction period in this country, where we saw the Civil War go from being a fight about protecting and preserving the Union and freeing enslaved African Americans and getting rid of slavery, that it was a war that was started by slavery and slave interests. It went within a decade to being a war about states' rights, where black people had no real input or um, say over the prosecution of that war. But even at that, with the rise of the lost cause narrative, that was a different set of circumstances because although you might have had presidential administrations and Congress not particularly standing up for the right thing, I don't think that they were necessarily actively engaged in promoting policies. I mean, you had President Woodrow Wilson showed Birth of a Nation at the White House, but that's a little bit different than promoting a policy that says that the African American experience or the experience of black and brown people or LGBTQ plus people doesn't count, to say nothing about women's history. Um, so I think I probably took your question and walked all the way around the barn back to the negative side of things because I think I'm just in an area right now where I'm more concerned about getting through the next year, getting through the next couple of years. And NPCA is an advocacy organization, so we're going to advocate. And we can dream while we advocate. We can look for opportunities to change things and make things better. That's always a part of our mission and vision, but we got to fight right now.
I hear it. Oof. And that makes me think of, fights that have had in the past and how it's going to continue today. Dennis, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the Japanese internment camp. Because I imagine even that the beginning of that, there was probably a very different conversation. Is it coming back into the limelight now in a different way, perhaps?
Yeah, so one of the communities I have the privilege of working with is a Japanese American community and their efforts to tell the story of their incarceration and confinement during World War II, their unjust and unconstitutional confinement during World War II. And across the West, there are dozens of sites related to this history. There are 5 of them that are actually commemorated within the National Park Service as National Historic Sites. And then there's a few others, monuments and memorials and national landmarks. But when this attack and these efforts to erase and censor histories began, we started seeing stuff around Japanese American incarceration being removed from the FDR site in Washington, D.C., and there was some stuff in Hawaii. These sites themselves right now have not been affected. And maybe they're somewhat protected because, unlike many of the other injustices in our nation, federal government actually acknowledged that incarcerating Japanese Americans was unjust and actually provided compensation back in the 1980s. But I actually do find a lot of opportunity and inspiration in this moment because in working with these communities, I've seen them organizing and preparing, looking at what's happening at places like Stonewall and preparing for what could happen to their story. And all these sites, all these Japanese incarceration sites have very strong community-based institutions that support those sites that help tell the stories that usually in normal years be working with the Park Service to expand the storytelling that's taking place there. They run these amazing pilgrimages to these sites. And these pilgrimages are so inspiring. They're open to the public. One thing that they don't shy from is connecting that history to what's happening today, and in relation to, for instance, how Muslim Americans are treated, or obviously in this case, how immigrants are being treated. And so I find a lot of inspiration in that. And you can remove a sign, you can remove a web page about a history. Doesn't mean it's actually erased. There are institutions there that are going to ensure that the stories are being told, and you can turn to those institutions at a time like this when maybe you're not sure you're getting the full story. Maybe the Park Service isn't the most reliable storyteller at the moment. You can turn to these institutions for information. And they run, again, amazing programs. They're all primarily nonprofit, volunteer based. But if you get the opportunity to go visit one of the sites with one of these types of organizations, I think you'll get possibly even a more fuller experience than you might normally get just visiting the site on your own.
Oh, I have one more question for everyone, but I just wanted to open it up. If anyone has any questions for the panel, now's a good time, and then I'll wrap up with mine. Someone said they work with a friends organization for Japanese.
Camille, do you want to come on and say what you typed?
Yes. No, I like my ears perked up when you mentioned the Japanese incarceration, because we are working within Minidoka, Idaho, Friends of Minidoka, on their virtual education virtual tour series. And it's been really interesting. We're constantly having this conversation of, how do we balance this, not at a national, I mean, they're very sensitive to the national level and not being affected by any shutdowns or targeting or that kind of a thing, but they're more concerned with the general population when we're talking to people who are interested in history and interested in learning about this history. They're not necessarily all on one side or another when it comes to political component of this. And of course, we've done a bunch of, looked at a bunch of research and what people are saying about language, but I'm just wondering, for Dennis, or maybe even the others, if you've walked that line at all, what you've learned.
To summarize the question is the question that, how do we tell the story in a way that is authentic and honors the local community, but that can be accessible by anyone on either side, since we are talking politics?
Yeah, it's a really interesting piece for me to wrap my head around, the idea of being accessible to people who, making history accessible to people who may not trust that history is being told in the way that aligns with their political belief system.
I think that's the key role of the Park Service. I mean, that's why you go and hear the history from rangers who are able to bring those stories to life and are able to identify threads and themes that our populations today can identify with, or maybe we've experienced something similar. And it's those the roles of those rangers to really make that connection for people. Everyone comes to the parks with their different political beliefs, their different backgrounds, their different idea of what they're going to encounter when they go there. But it's those rangers who really facilitate that shared experience by everyone who's on a park tour to really come away with, here's what happened. We're presenting the story for you. You can use your own experience to interpret it to impact your own life in however way you want. But they want to make sure that when people go to these sites, they're learning about what actually happened, and people can come away from that shared experience with their own personal interpretation as well.
And these are lifelong professionals, right, who've dedicated themselves to telling these stories accurately and comprehensively, or in many cases, telling the science accurately, because we're seeing that erased as well. But unfortunately, they're the ones that are also most under attack right now. I mean, we've lost 25% of our staffing at the park since last year. That was already after over a decade of neglect and losses in staffing. And so, unfortunately, those are the types of rangers that are most valuable, when it comes to telling these stories, but who we've seen lost in this last year.
I'll add to that. We have a very interesting position for She Shapes History in that women's history surprisingly seems to not be, it seems to be the safe advocacy right now.
Mm.
Everyone on both sides, at least forward facing, can all get behind, no, we want to support women. Women need support, whether or not they agree on how that's done. Excuse me. So we will get potentially terrible timing. Excuse me, we will potentially on our tours get people who are in different politics. So we've thought
Mm.
about that a lot. The tours, I said, it is titled Badass Women of New York City. So it is self-selecting in a way, even by the choice of the words of the tour. You are going to attract someone who is thinking a little more radically, perhaps, rather than traditionally. However, one of the stops we make is about this woman, Fenia Mandel, who worked with Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger is a story that is told many, many times, and many people are aware of her and her efforts for women's reproductive health and women's health in general. But when you get into Planned Parenthood, that can be very, which is the result of her work, that can be very polarizing. So we are telling the story of Fenia Mandel, who worked with her to open up her very first clinic in Brownsville in Brooklyn. And Fenia Mandel worked as a translator, and she was translating all of the information into Russian, into Yiddish for the local community. She was part of the local community. So it's this amazing story because it's the action that it's showing is that this woman made this work accessible to the people it was meant for, right? That's the lesson that we tell. Like this, Margaret Sanger's work would have meant nothing if she couldn't actually communicate and earn the trust of the local community. However, when we talk about it, and this is all true, that it was for reproductive health. We're not talking about abortion, which can be polarizing. We're talking about this idea of these women don't have access to information on how to space out pregnancies, how to prevent unwanted pregnancies, and they're dealing with the effects of having too many children. So that we're still telling a similar story, but in a way that isn't going to be as polarizing or potentially cause conflict within guests on a tour. So that was very, very intentional. And this is almost the work that Sherry is talking about. Like it takes so much work to do this, which is why it's so much easier for your average experience provider to just tell the sanitized version or to just tell the story that we know everyone can agree on, because it takes a lot of work to figure out how to tell these stories.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you all.
Anyone else? Or I'll jump to my last question.
Well,
For all of you
Nikki,
on the,
if I
yeah,
might, I mean, I just
please.
quickly add, I think it was a New York politician, Mr. Moynihan, who once said, "You're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts." And so if you have someone who wants to walk into an interpretive situation and they want to claim that slavery was not a root cause of the American Civil War, or that racism and white supremacy are not challenges that we still face to this day that help to shape our views on black and brown people and civil rights and other things like that. Yeah, I understand the need for people in travel and tourism to be polite, but there also is the need to have a framework, a spine to our history where we can agree on what the truth is. And then you can determine how heavily you want to lean on that, or if you feel like maybe you need to avoid that for the circumstances. But I think we need that framework, we need that spine. And that's one of the big challenges that we're seeing right now with the National Park Service is that we're losing that spine.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. That leads me to my last question. Like this is such difficult work that you are all doing, and I have such an appreciation, especially now for this work. What can we do as people of the travel industry, as lay people, as travelers? What can we do to support you in this work? That can be for anyone.
I'll go first. For the indigenous people, I think that as Alan said, standing up and advocating for these authentic stories, for these authentic experiences within the national parks. Um, and then also for us, seeking out those Indigenous experiences firsthand. We have our consumer-facing website, Destination Native America. And so over 500 experiences on there across the country, many of which are near the national parks where the traveler can come and not only hear the authentic stories, but support our Indigenous communities.
Anyone else? How can we help the NPCA?
Well, I would just echo that. I mean, if you want to help NPCA and if you want to help tell these stories, again, support those organizations, those community-based stakeholders who are helping to tell those stories. Camille talked about Minidoka. There are similar organizations connected to every Japanese American incarceration site in this park system. And again, they traveling with them, you might even get a richer experience. And they're all nonprofit organizations, as I mentioned, so they could use our support.
I would encourage people to continue to visit these sites. I mean, we want to make sure that not only are businesses being able to benefit from the fact that these park sites are there. I know whenever I take a trip anywhere, I always look to see what park sites are nearby, where can I visit next, and what history can I engage with on that trip. And I know I'm not the only one. So I think people really look for the experiences that can be enhanced by combining a park trip with working with local business to really facilitate and craft an amazing adventure, an amazing trip. That said, NPCA is an advocacy organization. We certainly encourage people to take action. I'll put a link in the chat in a minute just about erasure and speaking up on behalf of, in defense of telling accurate and full histories in our parks. And we would encourage people to take all of that. Plus, we're a membership organization as well.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for sharing your time, for sharing your expertise and your point of views. It's an important conversation to have, and I think for me, I am seeing the importance of storytelling. I mean, I know it's important and it's in our work, but I think this really sheds a light on how difficult that storytelling is, and the importance of it and meeting people where they're at and just pushing this narrative forward, as Alan said, to keep fighting that fight. So I appreciate all of you and the fight and wish you the best in your fight.